So welcome everyone, and many thanks for joining us today for this new webinar. We will be discussing with our colleague Artur Perchel about the EU financing and funding framework for clean buses. That's quite hot topic. It's very needed in these days, especially in view of the next targets of the Clean Vehicle Directive. Artur will give us a complete overview how to approach the topic, and I think we are ready to go. Just a brief introduction. Artur is your colleague is Deputy Director Europe at the UITP department. He's the lead for EU funds and financing, and part of his work is obviously coordinating UITP engagement with European institutions in charge of funds and financing. So he is our expert, the contact person when it comes to EU funding for public transport. The program for today it's quite straightforward. We will have an introduction on the topic, followed by the main architecture on EU funding and financing, and Artur will focus on different programs and policy recommendations. At the end, as always, we will have questions and answer round. We already invite you to consider which are the hot questions you have in mind, and please feel free to share them either through the chat, or what we like the most, you raise your hand and we can engage in a discussion together. This will take place at the end of the presentation. As always, our goals is to provide you in this our webinar as much as possible comprehensive overview on the topic today, the EU funds and financing and funding instruments, what is available for the public transport sector. We will have a look to the Recovery and Resiliency Facility, country benchmark and investment measures assigned. Also, what are the aspects that we would need to consider when we are approaching the question on financing and funding, and also where can you relate to, what are the sources of information that you can consult to further explore the topic. As usual, you know that for our discussions, we ask you kindly to please keep your microphones mute. Whenever there is a need, please raise your hand or place a question or a reaction in the chat. Also, if you have access to interesting information documents, links that you consider relevant for the topic, we also use the chat to share this among the participants. And again, if you would like to have the word, please raise your hand and switch on your camera, because that's the way we like to discuss. The session is recorded, as I informed you at the beginning. Please consider this in case you will not like to be recorded. And yeah, I wish you a very nice and interesting webinar. We count on your support to make the discussion more rich. So I will share now the floor to Artur. So please feel free to share your screen.
Thank you very much, Aida. I will directly share my presentation with you. Just please be so kind to confirm whether you see everything.
We do. Thank you.
Great, super. So welcome. Good morning. I hope you are all doing well. I'm Arthur, working with Europe department, in charge next to trying to co-manage the department in charge of leading our EU funds and financing files or dossiers. So yeah, it's a great pleasure to be today on the webinar, and I hope that you will not only be interested in the content, but you will also perhaps learn something new, something actionable for your own companies or your own cities. And then perhaps after the presentation, I'll be very happy to get engaged in questions or in dialogue with you, perhaps not only to reply to your queries, but also perhaps to hear your remarks. Perhaps you have some stories to share as well, so that you can enrich not only us as a community today, but also myself. Yes, so perhaps a word of introduction. That the Europe department is a part of UITP, dealing directly with legislation, policy, and lobbying. So this is what we do on a daily basis. And obviously funding and financing is very much at the heart of what we as a department do, and obviously at the heart of plenty of our members in Europe. So I'll be covering today, obviously, only those instruments and facilities that are related to European Union financial architecture. So I won't go any farther than that in terms of the national schemes or any other funding or financing sources. This will be purely focusing on what European Union as an entity has to offer to our sector. My presentation, just a caveat, my presentation is focusing on major EU funding and financing infrastructure instruments. The presented instruments today will not only revolve around support for clean buses, although many of the instruments that I'll be talking about do have lines that are designed for supporting zero tailpipe emission vehicles. So wherever necessary, I'll be highlighting this fact for us today. Okay, very briefly, so why perhaps investment is so important for us as UITP, but obviously for our members. I mean, money is always a big issue. If you don't know what's happening at the EU level in terms of policy and legislation, it's always also about money. So I think where there is money, where there's financing, there's also legislation and policy in place. And we as a department, myself in particular, try to make sure that the voice of the European operators authorities is well heard in terms of our financing and funding priorities. Particularly now after COVID and with the soaring energy prices, you may imagine, and I'm sure you are experiencing this very often as an authority perhaps or operator, that access to stable, reliable, and substantial financing and funding streams is just necessary. We have seen during the corona that there was a significant increase in expenditures, but at the same time, significant decrease in income and local taxation because of the halt of all the economic activities, so forth. So we see it's bouncing back slightly, but we are not yet there in terms of the levels pre-pandemic wise, in terms of collecting taxes, or even the ridership levels in many of the cities and metropolitan areas around Europe. So for us, also the financing is not, perhaps to kick off, it's not anymore perceived as a cyclical or structural support, but we like to think about it as a climate investment. This is broadly touching upon the EU approach to generally to the future of mobility, to the future of continents as such in terms of the European Green Deal. For us, it's extremely important that the financing of local mobility plays an important part of delivering on the European Green Deal objectives and policy targets. You remember the continent wants to be climate neutral by 2050, and there are particular sets of climate targets by 2030 as well. So that's why for us as a priority, also financing plays an enormous role in ensuring the delivery of the European Green Deal, particularly the components related to smart transportation, clean and sustainable mobility, and obviously greening of the mobility as such, and particularly greening of the urban mobility, urban bus fleets, but also urban rail. Moving forward, just a brief introduction to our priorities. Obviously, across a lot of our advocacy and lobbying efforts, the push towards modal shift is featured heavily, and obviously, in order to get there, to modal shift or greater modal split in favor of collective modes of transportation, you need to have reliable, modern assets and infrastructure to deliver this promise. So I hope it's a no-brainer. I think this is something, but nevertheless, despite the fact that we've been all the time speaking about the modal shift. This is not always properly understood at the higher echelons at the European Commission or European Parliament, because you may imagine there are plenty of different sectors that are competing for attention, for funding. So transportation, and particularly local transport, is one of them, and we often, see the barrier of subsidiarity, where policies regarding local transportation are made at the local level. That's why the European Union very often say, it's not us, but nevertheless, they do have a number of strategic documents, such as the 2011 white paper, and now forthcoming sustainable smart mobility strategy and a whole urban mobility framework, as some of you may have heard about. So this is slightly changing in favor of urban areas, in favor of local mobility, and also including local public transport. But obviously, we've been seeing, especially across the 2014-2020 period, that was the last EU budget, where we see it, especially now after the pandemic, that the traditional sources of financing, being grants, so non-reimbursable form of support, are perhaps not yet over, but they are slightly diminishing. And they are diminishing because obviously there is less public money available. And the second factor is that there's more and more private dimension in play, meaning there are plenty of, national promotional banks being involved. There's also the whole framework around climate financing, green bonds, and so obviously also equity financing and debt instruments. So there are plenty of instruments that are also blending public and private financing, EU funds, with investment bank financing as well. So we see a lot of merges, blending of different type of funding, also public-private partnership. So there is a changing shift in an understanding of EU financing from purely based on grants and moving towards more and more involvement, better and bigger involvement of the private capital, investment banking. So this is important to notify you about. Well, before I will kick off the overview of the funds, I would like to just share with you our own sort of typology, how we sort of approach, why we speak about funding and why we speak about financing apart. So obviously funding, we do perceive funding according obviously to the legislation by the European Union as non-repayable, non-reimbursable forms of financing, being primarily grants. And then at the other side of the barricade, you have obviously reimbursable forms of financing, such as elements I've mentioned earlier, being, for example, loans or equity debt instruments, quasi-equity, some guarantees, for example, by European investment banks, and blending of both as well. So you have also a third category, which is not here, but which is pretty common sense. So the blending of private, so grants with the financial instruments. This is also something, for example, the European Investment Bank is offering, and I'll be also going through it later on in my presentation. Well, so to kick off perhaps the core of the presentation today, to help you understand, to help you also navigate this surprisingly complicated maze of funds and financing for local public transport, I'd like to just briefly share with you this slide, which is actually pretty nice in terms of understanding where we are now and how the funds are being governed at the supranational level. So usually, particularly in the last financing periods, so usually EU is issuing a multi-annual financial framework, which is this is so-called long-term budget, but this is actually not a budget in a direct sense of the word, but this is more of a budgetary discipline with expenditure priorities, horizontal priorities, and core priorities. So this actually long-term budget called MFF, multi-annual financial framework, this was the traditional core of the EU financing. Now, because of due to the fact that the corona has, struck and has, demolished our socioeconomic sort of life across the last years, the EU decision makers have decided to introduce yet another element, which was the recovery plan. This is sort of a new understanding, a new approach to provide financing for all sectors of the economy. So next to the MFF on your right-hand side, the EU has featured also a temporary financial financing instrument, the Next Generation EU. And this is actually very important. I'll be speaking about it later on. Next Generation EU is good for around 40% of the current budget, which is huge, is mind-blowing. The astronomical figure of more than 2 trillion euros is difficult to imagine. But part of the Next Generation EU, the Recovery and Resilience Facility, is something many of you have heard about, I hope, because RRF is based, its implementation is based on the national recovery and resilience plans. Many, if not all of these plans, some form or another includes local mobility investments. So we can speak about it later on. Just for you to understand, when I'll be talking about MFF or NGEU or a recovery resilience facility, so there are two blocks on the very extraordinary recovery plan of Europe. And this division is worth to keep in mind. Okay, so for today's presentation, I have prepared for you sort of an overview, a number of instruments, obviously, but this is also important to keep in mind that each and every instrument offered by European Union has sort of a slightly different scope. Some of the instruments focus solely on infrastructure. Some of the instruments focus on asset procurements and fleets and greening of the fleets. Obviously, some of them, such as, for example, Horizon EU, which I won't talk about. This is mainly research, and this is small scale, in comparison to other funds in terms of providing support for local level. But for example, obviously, the lack of operations, as you see for many of the funds, means that most of them are sort of following the logic of investing different, more on the investment side than on the operational side. Meaning, for example, this is one of the issues that we've been having. For example, when some of the funds would focus on operations, it means that, for example, the resilience of existing networks, the resilience of existing assets and infrastructures could be better financed than today. Today, we see more, unfortunately, still that the focus is on new infrastructure, the focus is on new vehicles and so forth. While we also see that there are aging infrastructures and aging networks that could theoretically not to be, bulldozed and rebuilt again, but could be just properly maintained in order to prolong their, life cycle and prepare them for this climate resilience and further, operating under more severe conditions. So this is one of the issues that we should always look at, and from a more critical standpoint. So yeah, but let's just focus on the positive sides perhaps today. Okay, so this is more or less, I hope, understandable. And if there is anything that you'd like to sort of clarify, please just put it in the chat. Unfortunately, I don't see the chat as I'm sort of operating the screen, but later on we can obviously go through your questions and queries and comments. So please keep them definitely for the end. Okay, so I'll perhaps start from a number of instruments, and then we can have, and then sort of I will recap them in terms of financial value, so that you also know what's on the table in terms of the monetary value of each and every of the instrument. So very often, when people are speaking about transport financing, obviously they are starting with Connecting Europe Facility. So Connecting Europe Facility / transport, because there are three parts: digital, energy, and transport. So CEF transport, this is mainly This is a flagship instrument by Commission's Director General for Mobility, DG Move. CEF is an instrument ensuring the sound development and redevelopment of the trans-European transport network. As you may know, TEN-T is composed of the core network, the comprehensive network, and also all the urban nodes. In the past, I mean, until late last year, there were 88 cities defined as urban nodes. Now, with the revision of the TEN-T regulation guidelines, which we are also very much engaged in, the number of urban nodes have skyrocketed to 424, which is great. So CEF actually is a program of providing around 23 billion euros. Most of the money is going for rail infrastructure and the rail assets, and most of the financing has been dispersed between 2021-2023 CEF working program, and the last 30% will be dedicated for the working program from 24 to 27. So as you may see, also the logic behind this 70-30 division is due to Corona, to speed up the necessary investment, also to follow the objectives and promises from the European Green Deal to green infrastructure, to green assets, and also that is why the stronger financial injection in the first years of the CEF facility. The problem that we have, there is one problem and one opportunity I would like to mention, because these are heavy instruments in terms of theoretical explanation, also in terms of legislation. Obviously, everything is available. I'll just give you a very brief recap to help you understand in a nutshell how it works. So until 2020, so in the last financial period, 2014-2020, Connecting Europe facility has had, because it's still last months of financing, so had a very nice line called CEF blending facility. That was a financing line where under CEF blending facility, which was merging grants with AIB loans and other national promotional bank loans, there was a line for greening of the bus fleets. For example, colleagues from RATP, Île-de-France have even recently received their first batch of their electrical buses, for example, under the CEF blending facility. Unfortunately, because of the recovery plan for Europe, the blending facility has vanished. The logic was the European decision makers have, theoretically moved this line under the recovery and resilience facility, so under the national recovery and resilience plans. And this is indeed the case. Many of the plans do feature purchases of clean vehicles, zero emission tailpipe vehicles, and so forth. So this is indeed, there has been a shift, but it was very little transparency behind this shift. So also we, as our members, were very much taken aback. This decision last December was just taken out of the blue. But as long as the procurement for alternative fueled or charge vehicles is there, it's already good. But we, as a community, we have lost there a portion of financing. This has been, in fact, replaced by the so-called alternative fuel infrastructure facility. So AFIF, and AFIF indeed provides grants for setting up recharging or refueling infrastructure along both core, comprehensive, and urban nodes networks. So there is sort of this this facility. Unfortunately, we have seen from even 2 weeks ago, there was a first cutoff date for AFIF. I believe only 2 out of around 20 projects with the cutoff dates, only 2 projects were on the urban nodes. The rest were on the core, comprehensive, along the highways and so forth. So there is a significant under interest from our community to get this financing, to apply for AFIF funding. This is something we are currently working with DG Move, Unit B2 on transfer investments, to communicate better to our members, to the requirements, the process for application. This is everything obviously available online, but I think we'll have very soon a meeting between DG Move and our European members to ensure to convince them to apply more, because there is financing, and I believe if some of you wish to get a decent co-financing from CEF to set up a charging infrastructure in your multimodal transportation hub or in your depot, this is definitely possible. There are obviously requirements, stringent requirements, but it's possible. The money is there. So this is basically the Connecting Europe Facility explanation. We could go on forever because this is very interesting. The only caveat that I have here is that please note that Connecting Europe Facility has not been created for urban nodes, or has not been very much created to finance local collective transportation sector. We have made a research last year focusing on 2014-2020 financing period, where from a 22 billion euro budget, CEF budget 2014-2020, only 200 million euros has been provided to urban nodes, which is, you may easily make this calculation, it's around to 1% of CEF. So this was pretty disappointing. But once more, the logic behind CEF is to focus on the core and comprehensive, so intercity and so forth, high speed, and to a lesser extent to urban and local mobility, as this is covered by other funds. But this is nice to start with, to set the scene. Okay, European structural investment funds. So this is the whole cohesion policy, cohesion funding. Here we have two major funds that, until the recovery plan came in play, two major funds that were the biggest structural financing funding sources for our local, regional, suburban, rural mobility investments. So I'm talking about European Regional Development Fund and the Cohesion Fund. So these ERDF and CF were good for around 16 to 17 billion euro of investment in the local mobility, both assets and infrastructure. So this is huge. It was 16.5 billion euro between 2014 and 2020. And we do expect, although the figures are not yet available, that will be slightly more, I hope, between 17 to 20 billion euro now between 2021 to 2027. And obviously, the ERDF and Cohesion Fund are channeled to countries with structural needs, meaning mainly Southern and Eastern Europe. So there, the co-financing is usually up to 85%, although there are lines where 100% is also envisaged. And here we speak about the procurement of any asset and investment in any sort of mobility transport infrastructure. I'm sure many of you have already taken part or received the support from one of these cohesion policy funds. Now we have seen, and also this is part of both our lobbying, we're also lobbying by the National Public Transport Associations, such as, for example, VDV in Germany, GKM in Poland, or UITP in France, or Astra in Italy. We have seen, and luckily, that the urban mobility, sustainable multimodal urban mobility has been gaining ground, also in terms of policy priorities. It's been shifted from objective 3 to objective 2. So between 1 to 5 has been, moved up, which is great. And as you may remember, the cohesion policy logic is governed by the share management, meaning that the European Commission is signing operational agreement or partnership agreements between the member states, and then this is being channeled. This is being governed by investments are being governed by the member states on the national level, but obviously they are for investment higher than 75 million euros. European Commission has to provide its consent, and also you have a national operational plans, you have a regional operational programs. So there is a plenty of money here, and it will remain so, as the cohesion policy is generally one of the biggest sole budgetary line within the whole EU budget, dedicated for regions and cities. That's why this instrument has been traditionally very important. And I believe it will remain very important once the recovery and resilience facility will see to an end. So the cohesion policy will still be very important for a lot of our localities and our members as well, UITP members. So this is mainly cohesion policy, very important, particularly for local mobility. Okay, InvestEU. InvestEU, this is the continuation of the European Fund for Strategic Investments, or the so-called Juncker Plan, 2014-2020, maybe some of you remember. So InvestEU actually, in comparison to Connecting Europe Facility and cohesion funding, InvestEU is purely a financing set of financing instruments, financial instruments, meaning that this is a sort of an umbrella, is a platform for around, if I'm not mistaken, for the moment there are 13 different financial instruments under InvestEU. InvestEU is yet to be kicked off, although the legislation has been already passed by and approved by the council. So we will very soon, I believe, from January onwards, see a major rollout of InvestEU across Europe. InvestEU is important and will grow in importance because this is a market-based and you see also demand-driven instrument. So there is plenty of money, but it's sort of, as it is reimbursable, then also involving private funding. It will be, based on the interest from the market. And there is a very important sustainable infrastructure window, good for around 40% of the whole InvestEU, which is around, the window is good for 10 billion euros. And this will be very much used as well for all sort of projects, procurement projects, also financing of zero emission vehicles, but also of charging infrastructure and generally infrastructure, transport, mobility infrastructure in general, obviously also at the local and regional level. So there will be an envelope. Obviously, as I mentioned, is a demand-driven instrument. This has to be obviously taken seriously by the regional local level, because there will be competition between different transport modes and different scales. Obviously, the rail, intercity rail or long distance rail will be competing for money, but obviously they are also looking for major, well-designed projects that are relatively straightforward to be implemented by the time framework of the InvestEU. So this is important to note. Also, InvestEU will be correlated with the Recovery and Resilience Facility. Okay, I'm looking on the time, but so I have to just speed up because I like to speak about it, but I'll just be more brief because I would like to also hear some of the questions. Just transition mechanism, for your information, this is something that will come into play in the near future. Just transition mechanism is very much correlated with the European Green Deal, and there are different schemes dedicated. There will be schemes that will encompass financing and funding for mobility, local public transportation, and asset procurement as well, particularly the public sector loan facility. This is a mandate from the Commission to the European Investment Bank, so 75% of the loan facility will be implemented by the EIB, which is great because EIB has a very sharp commercial edge, meaning that they have a very relatively lower interest rates and longer repayment periods compared to other commercial banks. So there will be also financing under this line, but this is yet everything under discussion. As some of you may heard, the ETS schemes, so the emission trading, there is all sort of included into making sure that the just transition mechanism, just transition fund are kicked off and delivering. So I will let this, because this is not the core. AIB financing, very important and growing very much in importance. I would like to highlight that UITP is the only organization of this sort from our sector that has a very active cooperation with AIB. We have a memorandum of understanding with AIB, supporting AIB supporting us with data exchange and projects and so forth. So AIB is very much into financing clean transport. There is even a mechanism called Cleaner Transport Facility, where AIB is definitely deploying both financial, technical, and advisory help to, indeed, to speed up, to accelerate the deployment of zero emission mobility, particularly greening of the urban bus fleets. So this is something, the lending operations are extremely important. But equally their support via Jaspers and Elena and other advisory elements are all coming into play to ensure that AIB, now with their new transport lending policy, are more and more into financing, zero tailpipe vehicles and for related charging infrastructure. So AIB is definitely growing in importance as the EU climate bank, and it will be growing in importance definitely. As you see, AIB is not only lending, but also now has a mandate, for example, to deliver on some of the mechanisms, such as, for example, InvestEU. So it's actually growing in importance as a big lender. Okay, the most important part, and I will focus very shortly on this, recovery and resilience facility. I mentioned a few words about it. As you may remember, this is a temporary instrument. So it will, all the agreements has to be struck by 2023 with the implementation phase until 2027, both based on loans, on grants, but in terms of sustainable mobility, the green pillar, the green transition, most of the investments are predominantly grants. So there is a big line. There are 6 major policy pillars, one of them the green transition. And under green transition, as you may see from the table here, around 35% of all investments based on the national recovery resilience plans from each and every member state, excluding Poland, excuse me, because of some of the issues. So around 35% of all investment under the green transition pillar goes to sustainable mobility. So this is excellent. This is already excellent. Where exactly does money go? So the green mobility, sustainable mobility will be good between 2021 and 27 for nearly 71 billion euros. And where the money goes, obviously, to clean modes of transportation. So there is a predominantly lead by the rail infrastructure, followed, as you see, by urban transport infrastructure. And then obviously one of the lines as well are zero and low emission vehicles. So RRF and the National Recovery Resilience Plans were extremely important. This is where we spend a lot of efforts and time to ensure that the member states are, this is not a local level, it's national level, NRPs, National Recovery Resilience Plans. So we both we and other stakeholders made a lot of work to help them understand that the local level investments under RRF, this is a one in a lifetime chance to ensure that the greening, the sustainability of local mobility is there. And it's been indeed there, as you see from the graph here. This is a generally division, how each and every country you represent, how they allocated the shares of RRF for mobility. You see there are some countries better than others. Obviously, there's also sides of the country that plays a role. But here you definitely see, for example, Austria has plenty, 1/3 of the RRF is dedicated for transport and mobility. Well, this is one of the interesting slides I have always to share with colleagues and with our members. As you may see, both Spain and Italy are the biggest beneficiaries of the Recovery and Resilience Facility. While at the same time, the European Court of Auditors has identified Spain and Italy as the countries with the lowest absorption of EU funds in the last financial perspective. So they were around the level of 40%. So imagine you receive like 100 billion and you just absorb 40 billion. And at the same time, these countries are actually at the highest in terms of support and aid from the recovery plan. So there are some very serious structural issues in terms of absorbing the money. So even before the Recovery and Resilience Facility, these countries could not manage to absorb already existing money. And now you add recovery resilience facility on the top of already existing support. So you may imagine that not every dime, not every euro cent will be, unfortunately, used efficiently and effectively. So this is the nature of the beast as well. Very briefly, perhaps, the number of measures per country in terms of mobility. So all in all, we had nearly 400 measures from all national recovery resilience planning going to mobility. Most of them, there were 52 went for infrastructure, and around 36 went for governance, because the national recovery resilience plans were not only about investment, but they were also about the reform component. So how to reform your transport market, your transport system in a way that is and more efficient. In some of the countries, we're pushing new type of legislations, integrating, public transport tariff schemes. For example, in Slovakia, one of the projects under RRF is to integrate the national, local, and suburban level tariff and operations to have a one sort of system in terms of tariff and ticketing. So it's not only about the investment, it's also about the reform. And then there are three different pillars, but I won't go into it, just focus on the sustainability pillar of the transport measures. You see alternative fuels, logic is still huge. This is where most of the countries applied for funding. But also C11 at the very bottom, you see the urban transport is also with 34 measures. There were 14 countries identifying a strong member states identifying strong investments in urban transport. This is ITS. Let me leave this for another time. There is also plenty of smart transport investments across different modes. It's also waterborne and road and rail and urban. Resilience, obviously, this is governance, so mainly adaptation to climate change, different legal acts and documents and projects where they are sort of looking for support, grant support. I will leave this. Most of the things that I've mentioned already, these are the highlights from different plans. So what has been financed under, what is being financed under Recovery Resilience Facility? Obviously, for you, very important is that electromobility, hydrogen mobility, zero emission urban fleet is very much featured across many of the national recovery plans, both infrastructure-wise, but also asset procurement-wise. The challenges I mentioned, the availability, the absorbing of the available funds. So this is, huge chunk of money to swallow. Also, we very often heard also from the Committee of Regions, what we are working closely with DG Regio as well, that there was a unfortunately limited consultation with the local regional level when the national recovery and resilience plans were prepared. So this is a big issue. That's why the monitoring of the implementation, both by us as a community, but also by you as the local level, is so important to see. So how the national recovery plans actually match with the reality, what's being implemented according to which logic. And this is the final table I have to share. I won't go into details. This is still work in progress. They're very difficult for some of the funds to ensure the right figure. There are some figures between brackets that they are still unknown to external world. But I believe I'll be able to say about the 2021-2007 precisely in terms of local transport financing just around 2028, 2029, where all the programs will be implemented, because it's always very difficult on the fly to assess where the money is being invested, particularly with the shifts between different policies and programs and different major logics such as MFF and the Recovery Resilience Facility. All of this is pretty vague at the moment, but at least you have more or less the global figures if you'd be interested to to quote it, then be cautious that it's not always straightforward. Okay, so policy recommendation. I mean, you are not parliamentarians yourself, I believe, so I would just leave this as a slide to consult later on. But as you may imagine, I mean, this is very much straightforward. One of the main focus is to make sure that the sustainable financing is there for us as a sector, that we are important for the European Green Deal, and also, not only local the new investments, also maintenance and operational side of the assets infrastructure. It's extremely important to ensure this is something we'll be preaching a long time about, and this is the work we still will have, I'm sure, across the next years. Okay, last slide. Please do not hesitate, particularly our members, but also external actors. We are very much into financing. We are publishing policy papers. We just launched a brand new website where most of the information you've heard is available for each and every fund. So this is something we are regularly updating, also consulting with the Commission, the European Investment Bank, to make sure that the information and links are up to date. So try to, check it for yourself. And I'm very happy to receive some comments from you in terms of something is missing, or if you like to sort of have more details or certain facility or program, I'll be very happy to provide you more information. Not only because it's my job, but also I very much like to work with financing. Okay, so this is me. Hope it wasn't too boring or too late or too fast. I hope you have some questions, and thank you so much for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Artur. I think it's a super complete, very condensed indeed, right, presentation. I fully agree that it's important now, perhaps for our members of the CleanBus Europe platform and the external guests, because I see many other colleagues also joining today. That shows the relevance of the topic. I think, as you have presented, it's a titanic effort in 15 minutes to be able to guide us through the journey of the landscape of funding and financing. I would like now to share the floor with our participants. I hope there is already reactions and questions. Please just raise your hand and take the floor. And if there is no immediate reaction, Artur, perhaps what do you think? Because we still have 8 minutes. I believe perhaps we could have a look to the website together while some questions pop up. Perhaps if you want, you could share your screen with the website on, and then we go just shortly to perhaps from the perspective of a bus operator, no? So if I land on this website, how can I navigate a bit? So perhaps you can give us a short introduction while our participants come with questions.
Sure. With pleasure. Also, before doing it, perhaps I would like to also mention that for all those who are acquainted with UITP, also working as in a capacity of being, a member of UITP. What's also interesting is that we have launched also this year roundtable EU funds and financing. So we try to come up regularly, and will try to come up regularly together. So both myself and colleagues internally, but also members, all those interested, but particularly specialized and with experience on using EU funding and financing instruments. We come up together and we discuss both the experience, but also our advocacy approach, the current and forthcoming trends. So I would like to very much invite all of you interested to join this series. It's happening 2 or 3 times annually. This is actually the plan, and the first meeting was very valuable for both myself, I believe, also for members to see the maze of the EU funding and financing, how to make sense of it, how to work with decision makers, but also how to work at the local and regional level to ensure that the financing is available. What financing should be, best available for what type of investments. So just very briefly, I'll share my screen for a second. Yes, sir. This is the one. So this is actually the website that we are having. With a short introduction, so the main feature of the website is also based a bit on the table I showed in my presentation. So we have number of funds, 8 funds for the moment, where we are focusing on. Some of them were not mentioned today because there was no time, also because they are minor to the ones I presented. But for example, if you click on Recovery and Resilience Facility to receive the explanation, the values, what's there for our sector. And we also put a number of very important links to detailed information, both on the recovery plans, but also on the RF scoreboard, to ensure that the members are on the top of the game, because this is the knowledge is power, as Michel Foucault once said, and this is actually true also for the EU funds for local public transport. And also, we have a connecting group facility by each and every fund I mentioned and beyond. Also, the explanation who is actually the main implementing agency, what's the division in terms of the financing, in terms of the climate tracking, how to apply and call for proposals and so forth. So make life of people interested as easy as possible. And yeah, I think this is something of big benefit for our community. I hope this is also across the EU websites or EU institutions. You will not find a similar overview. So this is more beneficial for us also to understand where we are and how to compare, how to benchmark different funding, and also how to benchmark different funding across a specific timeline. So I can very much, talk more between 2014, 2020, how the urban mobility financing developed compared to 2021, 2007, both current and ongoing allocations and envelopes. So this is something very, very easy to work, and I encourage you all to have a look. Yeah, so if there are sort of more comments, and I will stop sharing and I'll back to you, Aida.
Thanks a lot, Artur. I totally agree. That's a very important piece of support when it comes to navigating the different instruments for financing and funding. Please have a look. You will have the presentation after the webinar. The slides will be uploaded as usual, as well as the recording. And the website is going to be definitely a good support to be able to follow up not just everything which is already available, but also the very complete presentation that Artur just gave us. I still don't see any hands, any questions. I would assume this means we need a bit of time to go through the information we just shared. Of course, you can always reach out to us with questions after the webinar, whenever you have already tested the website. As Artur said, there is not any other similar help tool available right now to understand the topic. So just also we would be happy to get your feedback on this. And of course, for UITP members or future members, we are very happy also to hear about your needs when it comes to funding the different workshops and working groups that Artur mentioned. I think today, more than ever, it's quite necessary, when we have to face the next years of fleet renewable energy transition periods, etc. Last chance, we have 2 minutes left. Comments, reactions? If not, perhaps then I think we can close the webinar for today. Thank you very much, Artur, for your time, for the very well architecture presentation, organized information, and we will be in touch afterwards with questions and follow-ups. So thank you, everyone, and we see each other in the next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you, Francois.
See you soon.
Have a good day. Yup. Ciao.